Hello, my friends. Welcome back to The Wilderness Way with me, Kristel Acevedo. I'm excited for today's guest, Dr. Sharon Hodde Miller, because she is incredibly wise and I have looked up to her for years. I met Sharon long ago when we were both attending the Summit Church in the RDU, and I remember discovering her blog, She Worships, and being in awe of her writing. I didn't know at the time that women could have a ministry like this. She really paved the way for so many women, and it's amazing to see how far she's come with her writing and her preaching. Let me give you her official bio. Sharon Hodde Miller leads Bright City Church in Durham, North Carolina with her husband, Ike. She also holds a PhD on women and calling and is the author of several books, including her most recent one, The Cost of Control: Why We Crave It, the Anxiety It Gives Us, and the Real Power God Promises. Also, she co-hosts a podcast called The Resilient Pastor Podcast with Rich Villodas and Glenn Packiam, and this is one of my very favorite podcasts to listen to. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Sharon. All right, well, welcome back to this podcast. I'm so glad to have Sharon on here. Sharon, thank you for saying yes to this. I have admired you for years and years and just think you're amazing at everything that you do. And I also really love all of your Disney videos, by the way. So that's super fun too.
Well, I'm pumped to be with you because you are my friend. And so any excuse that I have to hang out, because it's been a while. I'm glad to just connect with you and see your face.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I want to just jump right into the conversation. I know that this week can be a difficult week for people to process as we're talking about the super fun topic of sin. And as we look at the story of Adam and Eve and how they were the very first ones to experience the wilderness, you know, they were in this beautiful garden. They had trees and fruit and all kinds of goodness around them. And then they did something they weren't supposed to do and were cast out of the garden and they went into the wilderness, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think sometimes, especially for me, honestly, the first time I ever read that story, I was like, well, that's harsh, you know, like one strike and you're out. Like, what is the deal here? And I know that you are so wise, and I was hoping that you could help us process, why did God send Adam and Eve out of the garden?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a couple different ways to answer that question. The first is to understand big picture what happened in that moment when Adam and Eve rebelled against God, because it isn't just the kind of thing where they did the thing that they weren't supposed to do and then God was really harsh. The way that I often describe what happened in that moment is if you imagine taking a baseball bat and hitting a windshield and hitting it hard enough that there's this point of impact and it sends cracks throughout the entire windshield, but not hard enough that it shatters. So the frame holds, but now there are cracks just running through everything. And so that is what has just happened in this moment. It's not that they disobeyed and then all God needed to do was just to, forgive them and pretend it didn't happen and move on. No, what has happened now is sin has been introduced into a world where sin did not previously exist. And it has sent its brokenness through everything. There is nothing that is left untouched, but at the same time, the frame holds. And so there's not a lot that you can see immediately that happens. Right. The first sign that sin has entered the world is actually shame and fear. Those are the first signs that sin, because shame and fear did not exist before that moment. And so just to understand now, all of creation has now been broken and is in need of repair. And that is what the entirety of the rest of the Bible is going to be about, is God's plan to repair what has now been broken. And so much of what Jesus does is getting us back to Eden, in a sense. Like even the fact that Jesus is resurrected in a garden, that is a callback, that he is restoring us back to that Eden. And so much of where we go awry is us trying to get back to Eden on our own human willpower. Right. So just big picture, that is what has happened in that moment. But in terms of what the reason why they are cast out of this garden is that God has invested Adam and Eve with free will. That is part of what it means to be human, is that
Mhm.
you are not a robot, you are not a puppet. You have the freedom to be in relationship with God. That is what makes it a relationship. And that has, wonderful things about it, but also challenges. And
Mhm.
what we see once free will is mixed with sin is that they have desired to live without boundaries. God has
Mm.
given them this boundary, this one boundary
Yeah.
on their will, and they decide to reject that boundary. And so, what God does, and what God very often does, is He gives them what they want.
Mm.
And I think that that is it's a very different way, but a helpful way of even conceiving of the wrath of God is very often God just giving us what we want. Like we're not
Right.
understanding sin is death to our souls and it is death to everything around us. And so with wrath, God is essentially just surrendering us to what we have already chosen for ourselves.
Mhm.
And so I would think of it not so much as pure punishment, but God really saying, okay, you wanted to live without boundaries. Okay,
Mhm.
then go live without boundaries.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so that is how I would narrate what is
Yeah.
happening in that moment.
Yeah, and I think that's a helpful framework as we even read the rest of scripture because
Hmm.
we see that over and over again as people choosing to live independently from God and
Right.
God giving them over to themselves of like, okay, this is what you are doing. You are hardening your own heart. And
Hmm.
so here you go,
Yep.
and
Yep.
and
Exactly.
that's helpful to see that it's not so much God just being hateful or being
Hmm. Hmm.
petty. It's that, okay, this is what you asked for. This is what you wanted,
Yeah. Well, and there are a lot of us that is how we learn.
Right.
We a lot of us have children like that
Mhm.
where you can tell them, don't do this, this will hurt you.
Mhm.
But they have to learn by doing it and experiencing the pain of that. And I think
Mm.
there is an extent to which that is also happening in
Mhm.
this case. They're testing God essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. So then what is it that we learn about God's character in this story that's important for us to know? If God is not just petty and hateful, like what is it about God's character that we're learning?
Hmm. We are learning that God is trustworthy, that
Mhm.
what he tells us we can believe. And when he told them that this will bring death in you,
Mm.
it didn't come the way that they thought that it would. And I think that's
Mhm.
also a really important thing to understand about the nature of sin is that, and this is kind of a digression a little bit from your question, but I
Mhm.
just think it's really important to understand we are very often tempted to think that when we sin and we don't experience an immediate consequence that we have found a loophole.
Mm.
And we see in this story of Adam and Eve that they're warned, if you eat of this tree you will die, but then they don't die.
Mhm.
And so for a brief window of time it would seem that Satan was right, that the serpent was right. And
Mhm.
we replay this gamble over and over so many different times in so many
Yeah.
different ways. A great example of this is for those of us who were raised in churches that warned, if you have sex before marriage, you're ruined.
Mhm.
You've
Mhm.
ruined your future marriage. You're going to deal with insecurity forever.
Hmm.
Your future sexual relationship with your spouse is going to be sullied. No one is going to want you. There's
Mm.
all these things that are sort of promised if you do this thing. And then what ends up happening is people have sex before marriage, and then that doesn't happen. A lot of those
Right.
things
Yeah.
don't necessarily happen. And it's easy to think then, okay, well, what else is the church wrong about? What
Mm.
what else did they get wrong? Because they promised, they warned all these things would happen and then it didn't happen. And so to understand that really whatever is happening, and this is what I love about Proverbs, and I'm sorry, this is like the longest
I
answer to
love
your
it.
question.
Listen, you're giving
But
it to us. We love it.
this is what I love about the metaphor. Proverbs uses this metaphor of a path, where it talks about how there's a path to life and a path to death. And I love this metaphor because what it reminds us is it's not that you found a loophole, it's that you're still just in the middle of the path. You haven't reached the destination yet. This has just headed you in a particular direction. And very often, what is the first thing to die is your own conviction about sin. That's the first death that usually happens, is we start numbing our consciences, or we try to explain why this wasn't so bad, or, the church lied to me, whatever it is. And so to just understand that in this moment, it could even seem for a split second that the serpent was right, that God was holding out on them, that he was unnecessarily restricting their freedom and their power and their knowledge for his own capricious reasons. But then immediately after that, they are confronted with shame. They're confronted with fear. Fear is actually the word that is used when Adam says, I was hiding because I was afraid. This is the first mention of fear in the Bible. And so immediately they're experiencing, oh, it wasn't that kind of death. It was a different kind of death, the death of security, the death of peace, the death of right relationship. There were other kinds of deaths that they hadn't even imagined. And so I think that's one of the things that this story reminds us is that God is trustworthy. And when he tells us that something is bad for us, that it is dangerous, that he is not being arbitrary about, sexual immorality or whatever it is, that our culture would say, no, this is actually freedom. When that's in contradiction with God saying, no, this is bondage, this is death, that this is something that we can look to and see he was right. He was right. And for us to remember what God warns us against, we need to take seriously because he loves us and he is trustworthy.
Yeah. And I think something that you mentioned a little earlier is important to then talk about here is that the rest of the Bible is about God basically creating a rescue plan for his people, right? Because it wasn't just that like, okay, well, it's broken now, it's shattered now, or but oh well, he actually has a plan to fix it, even though it really wasn't even his fault. Like he's not the one who shattered it. It was Adam and Eve who shattered it. And yet he's the one who's initiating the fixing of this brokenness.
Yeah.
And so how do we see that? I mean, I know you mentioned Jesus, obviously, but like even the first, I mean, to me, the first step of seeing this is like they tried to cover themselves, right, with these fig leaves. And then he's like, no, let me cover you with these animal skins,
Yeah, there's a number of signs right out of the gate that you see that God is already putting into place. You get the first kind of clues of a rescue plan. And another, it's called the proto-evangelion. I think that's how you say it. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yep. The first gospel.
Yes. So this is in Genesis 3, maybe verse 15 or 16. I have to
I'm gonna say yes. I'm gonna affirm you blindly.
I know. I've got to pull it up now to see when he talks about he says, to the woman, I'll make your pain. Let's see, which one is it? No, that's not it. That's not the right verse. But he talks about when he talks to the serpent, and he talks about how the seed of humanity will essentially crush his head. And that is understood to be the first clue pointing to Jesus, that Jesus is the one. And they even incorporate that into the movie, The Passion of the Christ. There's the scene where Jesus steps on top of a serpent's head. And that is a callback to that verse in Genesis 3. And so you see that already kind of like the seeds of this. And then it is so beautiful when you go to Jesus's life there are so many details that are an echo back to the garden. I already mentioned Jesus's resurrection happening in a
In the
garden.
garden.
But another really beautiful one is that at the launch of Jesus's earthly ministry, right before that, he goes into the wilderness where he fasts for 40 days. And during that time, he is tempted by Satan. And what is really happening there is Satan is tempting Jesus with the exact same offer that he once offered Adam and Eve. And so he is rewriting the story. And 3 is the number of completion. And so it's symbolic that he is essentially undoing what happened in that moment, undoing that choice, doing what we could not do. And so it's amazing how there's so many details here in Genesis 1, 2, and 3 that sort of reach out and touch one another in the Gospels, where Jesus heals and fulfills everything that is broken in this moment.
I love that. That's beautiful. Well, so help us process now. What advice do you have for people who do find themselves in a wilderness season, especially as a result of a sinful choice that they made, a conscious choice they made to live independently from God, and now they're kind of seeing that they're on this path to death, and it's not a fun season. They're probably dealing with shame, as you said, and guilt. What can we tell those people to give them some sort of hope?
Yeah, as you mentioned, shame is the most powerful self-made prison that exists. And it's one of our greatest adversaries. And I think that is why our enemy would love nothing more than for us to hear the voice of God through a filter of shame. And unfortunately, what happens, it's a really helpful exercise to consider when you read either God speaking or Jesus speaking in the Bible. Like, what tone do you hear his voice in? Like,
It's so good.
who in your life is influencing how you hear God speak? Because for a lot of people, it's either their parent or their childhood pastor. And for me, I have really wonderful parents. My dad specifically has made it very easy for me to understand what the love of God is like. And so it is easy for me to read the voice of God, to read the voice of Jesus through a filter of patience and long suffering and grace. But for a lot of people, it isn't. And so to just name that, if there is a filter of shame that you've overlaid on the voice of God, that is not how the Father speaks to his children. That even when he has really harsh words, you think about his words to the Pharisees, the woes, woe to you, you whitewashed tombs, he speaks very, very harshly, but he will later die for these men.
Right. Yeah.
And so he's not just swatting at them. He is pleading with them. He's trying to shake them awake to see how their own hypocrisy is killing them. That is what God is like. That is what we know God is like through the person of Jesus. And so I want to name that, if that is you and there's some sin that you think is just too ugly, too dark, to whatever, to know that is shame. That to whatever, that is shame overlaid on top of your understanding of that. And so I think that's a really important place to start, is to name your shame so that you can recognize, this is not the voice of my Father. This is not how the Father speaks to his children. And to know that you are the child of a God who pursues and adores and removed heaven and earth to see you be whole. That is what he is like. And that is why we can come to him in confidence.
Yeah, that is so good. And I'm really, really glad you mentioned that, because I was one of those people that I would read the Bible and I would feel shame, or I would feel like I was being reprimanded. Even Jesus's words, because I did have this like filter of of like what, so he's wagging his finger at me,
Yeah.
And I remember even recently I was reading the story of Jesus in the boat when they're crossing a lake and there's a storm and he's asleep. Everyone else is freaking out because there's a storm. They think they're going to die and he's asleep. And then like finally they go and wake him up and he calms the storm. And he basically tells them like, what were you scared of? Like, what's going on? And I remember in the past reading that like, oh yeah, like, yeah, why were they scared? And I shouldn't be scared. And I shouldn't doubt. But then I read it with a different tone. Like I literally out loud read it. And instead of saying like, why did you doubt? I read it, hey, why did you doubt? And just even changing my tone of voice, reading it out loud helped me to hear Jesus' voice in a way that it was filled with compassion. And that was healing for me. And so even like it sounds silly maybe to someone listening, like you want me to like read the Bible out loud to myself. Yeah, like read the Bible out loud to yourself, like in a tone of voice that is filled with compassion and empathy. And I believe that will be healing for somebody today.
Yeah. Well, and especially to know he is omniscient. Anytime God asks a question, it is not for him. Right. When God asks Adam, where are you? That is a rhetorical question. He's not like, Adam, you got me, you found this really great hiding place. I don't know where you are. That is a question for Adam to ask himself. Jesus asking them, that is a question for the disciples to ask themselves, to search themselves, to self-reflect. It's not a condemnation.
Yeah. And it's for the goal of seeing what he already knows, that he does care, that he is for us, that he loves us, that he cares for us. And so I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, thank you so much for being here and having this conversation with me. I'm grateful to have you in my life. I love powerful, amazing, smart women. And I'm glad that I get to share you with our friends who are going through the Bible study.
Well, it's been fun.
Thanks for listening to the Wilderness Way podcast with me, Kristel Acevedo. If this episode encouraged you, share it with someone who might need it too. And if you have a moment, leaving a review helps others find the show and join us on the journey. This podcast is a companion to my Bible study, Away in the Wilderness, Meeting God in the Desolate Places of Scripture, available right now wherever books are sold, including the Spanish edition, Un Camino en el Desierto, Encontrándonos con Dios en los lugares desolados de las Escrituras. You can learn more about the study and future projects at kristelacevedo.com. Until next time, walk with grace and grit.